Hi, I'm Lisa Catherine Harper, and I'm here to talk about my book, A Double Life Discovering Motherhood. It's a nonfiction book that examines the physical, emotional, and psychological transformations of pregnancy. And I've got a bunch of questions here that were posted on Reddit. And the first one is one of the most fun questions I've ever gotten. And it asks, how exactly did you explore the transformations of motherhood? Did you get knocked up just to write a book? No, I didn't get knocked up to write a book. That would be probably, the most interesting bit of stunt journalism that's ever, occurred. But what happened was I got pregnant and I was an academic and I was a writer. And so what I do is I read and I research. And as soon as I got pregnant, like every other pregnant woman who's ever lived in a first world country with lots of information, I read and I read and I read and I read. And the more I read, the more I realized that pregnancy and the changes that accompany pregnancy were extremely interesting. And so I started to read even more. I read medical journals, I read medical textbooks, and then I started to write about my own experience in tandem with doing this kind of really academic research. And then I merged the two, and that's how the book began to come about. And the second question is, why did you write this book? And the answer to that question is really contained in the first question. I wrote the book because I had no expectation that pregnancy and becoming a mother would be interesting. People told me that it would be hard. People told me that I would be tired. People told me that my life would never be the same. But no one told me that pregnancy would be interesting. And what I discovered is that when you have a baby, when you become pregnant, it's not just 9 months of your belly getting bigger and then you have a baby. But in fact, every single system of your body is transformed and changed in order to accommodate the pregnancy. And so as I began to do the research, I began to realize that in all of the physical transformations and changes of pregnancy are the metaphors for the emotional and psychological changes. So that's really how the book came about. It was exploring just how profoundly this really ordinary event changes you. Another reader wrote in and asked, did you write your book during your early stages of motherhood, or was it a retrospective examination of your experience? And the answer is both. I did start writing as soon as I got pregnant, and I wrote through my entire pregnancy, and then I also wrote during the first year of my daughter's life, up until she was about 9 months old. And that's one of the ways that this book is really different than other books on the shelf. It begins with conception, it ends with the acquisition of language, which comes around the 9th or 10th month of your child's life. So when I wrote the last chapter of my book, which is about language acquisition, I realized that the book was about change and transformation. So it's not a book about pregnancy. It's not a book about the first year of baby's life. It's about becoming a mother. And when I realized that's what the book was about, then I went back and I revised and I edited and I did a lot more research and I took a lot of things out and I shaped the book so that the book really was about those kinds of universal changes that almost every mother experiences to some extent. And related to that question is the question that I get at every single reading I've ever done, and that is, how did I find the time to write during my pregnancy? And how did I find the time to write after my daughter was born? It's a great question because so many people are exhausted. So many women are exhausted during their pregnancy and even more so during their baby's first year of life. And honestly, for about the first 3 months of my pregnancy, I could do almost nothing. I was terribly sick with morning sickness that lasted all day long. I write about that in my book in a chapter called Signs and Symptoms. So I didn't get a whole lot done the first 12 weeks. I didn't really read, I didn't really write, but I had a pretty good pregnancy, and I read and I wrote whenever I could while I was pregnant. And then after my daughter was born, I made it a priority to write when she slept. And she was a good napper. I made sure that we, worked hard to get a decent sleep schedule so that I would take a nap while she took a nap, one of the times. And then the second time she napped, I would just make sure that I wrote. One of the things that happened after I had my daughter was that I returned to my writing with a new sense of urgency, because I knew that if I didn't sit down and get the writing done that I needed to get done while she was sleeping, that it would never happen again. It would never happen during that day, and I was never going to get that time back. So I learned to be really disciplined in a way I think I wasn't before I had children. And I think that happens to a lot of writers as well. Another question that I get a lot is, how do I educate myself about what to expect during pregnancy? And did I know a lot from speaking with my friends and my family members, or did I have a go-to book? I didn't really have a go-to book. One of the reasons that I wrote the book was because I realized very quickly it is nearly impossible for a layperson to know everything. And I don't present my book as a how-to or a guide or an everything you need to know about pregnancy. I write about specific medical issues and specific medical facts about pregnancy that are related to issues of change and transformation more generally. But what I did was, I mentioned earlier, I did do a lot of reading and research in medical textbooks and medical journals. I read every book on the shelf, and probably my favorite one was the Mayo Clinic book of pregnancy. It's almost an encyclopedia, and it's this huge fat book, and it's full of facts. It's not judgmental. It doesn't scare you. So if you're looking for a great compendium, I would say buy my book to talk, so you can learn a little bit more about what you can expect emotionally and psychologically. And I would say have a good long look at the Mayo Clinic. Get it from your library, or if you can want to splurge for a bigger, fatter book, then I would go look for that one. But I think that one of the most important things that women can understand when they go into a pregnancy is that you can't know everything. You know, that's why we have OBGYNs. The next question is about writing the book, and it's a question that a lot of writers ask me, and that is, while writing A Double Life, did you suffer any writer's block? And if so, how did you overcome it? And the answer is no, I didn't suffer from writer's block. And I think that's one of the great gifts of becoming a mother for me. A friend of mine, the fiction writer Kate Brady, told me before I had my daughter that I would never again suffer from writer's block. And she was right. And the reason she was right is not because I write about my children all the time, and not because my children give me endless sources of material, but because when you have children, you have to become really organized and really efficient, and time becomes very precious and very urgent. I learned very quickly that I had to show up at my desk for my writing the same way that I showed up in my house for my children. I needed to be there. I needed to be present. I didn't have time to waste time, and I didn't have time to procrastinate. And I think that this is a lesson that very many writers learn very quickly if they have children, that you have to make the most of every single minute. And that was a great gift. The other question that I get a lot, and it's related to that last question, is who's had the biggest influence on your writing? And I would say that there are two writers who've had the biggest influence on my writing perennially. You know, since I was in college, Virginia Woolf, and Virginia Woolf has been a big influence on me, just in terms of her style, but also in the terms of the way that she's able to illuminate ordinary experience. And the second greatest influence on me would probably be the work of Joan Didion. And I say Joan Didion also because she is an impeccable stylist. I love the precision of her prose, and I also love her dedication to journalism, her dedication to research, her dedication to investigating facts in a rigorous and intellectual way, but also transforming them for the lay reader. I used to be an academic. I have a PhD in English. I was trained in theory. I love all that brainy, geeky stuff. But what I found after I started working as a professor was that I really didn't want to write for an academic audience. I wanted to write for a general audience, and that's one of the things that the gift of this book allowed me to do, was it allowed me to merge my love for fiction and my training in fiction with my love for research and for, you know, difficult facts, and for bringing those facts to a much wider audience. I have a whole set of questions here from readers about how things change, which are appropriate because my book really is about change. And the first one is, how did you feel when you first found out you were pregnant? What thoughts went through your head, and what did you do first? And it's a great question. It's a scene in my book. I think it's one of the, you know, essential scenes in any book about pregnancy or becoming a mother. We had been trying to get pregnant. I actually became pregnant on September 11th, 2001. I tell this story in the book. But I didn't know I was pregnant. Like very many other women, it's easy to mistake those early signs of pregnancy for, being sick or having the flu. So I didn't know. And when I realized it, I was actually on a plane, and I tell this story in the first chapter of the book, which is called Conception. I was on a plane. I was going to a wedding of my best friend in New York, and I was shocked. I felt in an instant that even though I had been expecting it, my life would never be the same. I felt that I wasn't ready. I thought that we were crazy for doing this, but I was also exceedingly happy. And when I landed in New Jersey, I went to my parents' house. I took a pregnancy test. I was indeed pregnant, and I was thrilled. I felt like my whole life had opened up in front of me and that things were never going to be the same again, which in fact they weren't. The next question is about the body transformation. What was the body transformation like? And I guess that's a way of asking, what were the physical transformations like? Everybody knows your stomach gets bigger, you put on weight, you look different, you get a little tired, you feel bloated, all those things that you generally think about when you think about getting pregnant, and the things that you worry about. But the transformations that were, for me, much more interesting and much more crazy had to do with things like the hormones that flood your body. There's a hormone called relaxin that floods your body that spreads your joints, and it spreads your hips specifically in preparation for giving birth. But what no one tells you, and what I write about in the book, is that it also affects every other joint. It doesn't just target your hips. It affects your knees and your wrists and your ankles and your elbows and your shoulders. And so, things started to ache and creak and really, really hurt. Varicosities cause things like, I sneezed constantly. And I had, you sneeze, you hiccup, you have heartburn, your skin pigmentation can change under the influence of all the hormones of pregnancy. You think and you feel differently also, and those are some of the best and the worst things about pregnancy. You can be flooded with a sense of complete calm, and you can also be sort of hijacked by anxiety and fear. The baby also rearranges all of your internal organs. The baby can sit on your bladder. The baby, as it grows, can shrink your stomach, or can compress your stomach, so you can't eat as much because your stomach literally has no place to go. Your lung capacity changes, so your blood capacity changes. You have your blood volume, sorry, not your blood capacity, your blood volume changes. You have up to 50% more blood in your body. And so those things are also things that you feel, and you feel your body functioning differently and moving differently and working differently, but no one really tells you exactly why. And it was the totality of all of those changes, the way that every single day new physical things started to happen and new physical symptoms started to appear that really made me realize just how dramatic and strange and unexpected the becoming a mother or having a baby really was. One reader asked if I had any crazy cravings when I was pregnant, and any that lasted once I gave birth. I couldn't eat for about 3 months. For 12 weeks, it was nearly impossible to eat anything. And then after that, everything returned completely to normal. And the one thing that I craved was In-N-Out Burger. I stopped almost every night on my way home from teaching, which is only once or twice a week. And I got In-N-Out Burger at like 10 o'clock at night. I just craved hamburgers. And it didn't really last as a craving, but I do still love to eat In-N-Out. Another reader wanted to know what was my biggest fear while expecting, and this is something that I write about in the book in a chapter called Tested. I was really worried, like every other pregnant woman and her partner worries, that the baby wouldn't be healthy, and how I would cope with it. If the baby had a genetic defect or an abnormality or a physical handicap, how would I deal with it? I didn't know how to prepare myself for that. And I wrote about those tests, and I wrote about those fears. And I think there are things that every single woman faces, and I think that it is really important that we educate ourselves and we avail ourselves of the tests that are available, and we understand the risks that age presents. Age can be a great gift to women who have babies later, but it can also present real challenges and real problems. What do you miss about life before kids? This is a great question. I think this is one of the things that we all talk about, mothers and fathers both. Um, for the most part, I am really content being a mother, and I don't miss too much about life before kids. And one of the reasons is because very early in my pregnancy, my husband turned to me. He's much more well adjusted and calm and Buddhist about things than I am. And he said, I'm really excited about what's happening, but I don't want to be so excited to miss what's going on now. And I kind of looked at him and I said, what do you mean what's going on now? Because I had always lived in my head. I had always lived for the future. I had always been, sort of ambitious and forward thinking and not really very grounded. And I thought about what he said, and I also write about this in the book. This is the second chapter of the book called Expecting, and I realized that he was absolutely right, that expecting really for me meant not expecting, that the only thing that I could be certain of from that moment on, from really from the moment of conception on, was change. That change was the bedrock of motherhood, that change was the bedrock of being a parent, and that if I didn't accept change, I was never really going to be able to be present for my children, and I was never going to be a really good mother. And that's one of the things that I write about over and over again in the book, are the different ways that your life changes and the different ways that, motherhood can really ground you. I didn't want my life to stay the same when I had children. I had a very full life. I had traveled a lot. I had a great education. I felt like I had done my time, doing the party thing and staying up late all night. And so I was ready for my child to transform my life. And I found that to be an interesting part of being a human being, was this next step. That said, my husband and I were avid dancers. I met him swing dancing. We did vintage jazz dances like Lindy Hop and Balboa and the Shag, and we performed and we competed, and we really had a great fun life doing those things. And we did a lot of social dancing, and I do miss that, and we don't do enough of that anymore. The next reader asked a question that's really been on my mind a lot lately, because I actually have two children now. I have a girl and a boy. After my daughter, I had a son. And this reader wants to know, when you found out you were having a girl, how did you feel? How did you think raising a girl might differ from raising a boy? And also, do you think boys and girls should even be raised differently at all? This is a great question. I've seen so much chat and discussion about this lately on the internet and in the media. I was thrilled that I was having a girl. I really, really wanted a girl. I was sort of desperate for a daughter. And so I had no reservations about raising a girl. I had a great role model in my mom. I had a great education. I had great opportunity and access to experience. So I wasn't really nervous about having a girl. I was, in fact, more nervous about having a boy. I got pregnant. I found out it was a boy, and I thought, what am I going to do with a boy? How am I going to raise a boy? Well, of course, my mother laughed at me, and she said, you do the same thing with a boy that you do with a girl, and you do the same thing with every child. You read to them, you hold them, you love them, you teach them to talk, you teach them to eat, you take them on outings, you take them to the library, you give them blocks, you give them whatever toys, you give a girl, you give a boy. And she was absolutely right about that. I have, given both my kids the same toys. They gravitate toward different things. There are absolutely differences that I suspect are based on gender. My son, for instance, has gravitated toward balls since the day he started walking. My daughter is much, much more verbal. But on the other hand, it's also hard to know what is due to their different kinds of personalities. I think that the most important thing when you think about gender and children is that you pay attention to the individual child and to the needs of the child and to what that child is telling you about their interests, that you expose them equally to all sorts of things, so they have equal opportunity to education and to experience. But on top of that, I think the single most important thing that you can do as a parent is try to avoid marketing, try to avoid toys that are specifically marketed toward girls or toward boys. So avoid, as much screen time as you can, and avoid, the pink and blue aisles in the big box stores if you can. And that's really worked pretty well for us. But it is definitely an ongoing battle to keep opportunity and toys and books and clothes and all of those things as, relatively gender neutral as you can. The next question, what was the best part about being pregnant? And I would say the best part of being pregnant was also the worst part of being pregnant, and that's the hormones. And I actually write about this in a chapter called The Mind-Body Problem. On the one hand, your body is flooded with all these hormones that during pregnancy and during nursing actually can give you this really profound feeling of contentment and ease, and they can make you really happy, and it can make your sex life better, which is another thing that nobody tells you. But the flip side of that is that the hormones can also make you miserable. You feel like you're living in a fog. You feel cut off from everybody else. You only want to think about the baby. I felt very myopic, very short-sighted, and very, very disinterested in a lot of things that I had been interested in before. I mean, for a long time, I thought I would never be interested in, in the books I had read before. I could only read short things. I could only read magazines. I didn't want to talk to my husband about his work. I just wanted to think about the baby. But I think part of that is absolutely hormonal. So what I write about in the book is that on the one hand, you have this great gift of, being inward looking and being focused on the baby and feeling very physically content. And on the other hand, you just feel cut off from everything. And it's, I think, one of the ways that nature has of preparing you for this dramatic transformation that's about to take place in your life. And that is something that I think we all have to come to terms with, is understanding just how profoundly your life is no longer your own, at least for a couple of years, when the kids are most young and needing you most profoundly in a physical kind of way. Another reader wanted to know if I thought that there was a prime age for having children, and I would say, no, there's not a prime age for having children. You should have children when you're ready to have children. I do think that I absolutely benefited from having children later, but I also think, as I mentioned earlier, there are risks involved when you have children later. You have to be aware of the fact that, there are risks for birth defects and danger to the mother, increase as you near 35 and approach 40. On the other hand, if you have an education, if you have some experience, if you've had an opportunity to live a fuller life, I think you bring all of that to your motherhood and to the emotional resources that you need to parent. And I think that can only be a good thing for women, to be more independent as they enter the child-rearing years. What was the biggest misconception or previously held belief that becoming a mother changed for you? That's a really tough question. I think that I did not realize just how profoundly your body changes. I didn't realize just how total the transformation was. That was really the most shocking thing for me. I had been a dancer before I got pregnant. I met my husband dancing, and I thought that I knew a lot about my body and about how my body worked. But what pregnancy taught me is that I knew nothing about my body and I couldn't control my body. And the act of giving up that control, that illusion that we all have, that we're in control of our life, that we're in control of what happens next, motherhood made me throw all of that out the window and live much more focused in the present and much more accepting of the kinds of changes that we all have to face. Motherhood in many ways is just a great big metaphor, which is another reason why I wrote the book. This is a question that's related to the best part of being pregnant, and it's what's been the peak and what's been the low point of your experience as a mother. The absolute peak is what I write about in the last chapter of the book, and that is language acquisition. When your kid learns that there are words in the world, that things have names, that you can communicate. The experience of watching both my kids not learn to talk so much, but understand that, their polar bear has a name or the book has a name. Understanding that kind of passive understanding of language was absolutely stunning for me. And that may be because I'm a writer and, I'm an academic and I'm a reader, but watching them learn, and particularly watching them learn, was a phenomenal experience and a really, really great privilege. And so I write about that in the last chapter of the book, which is about that moment of language acquisition, how children come to acquire language, what language acquisition means, how, and then more generally speaking, how infant brains work and how children come to learn anything, how they learn to eat, how they learn to walk, how they learn to talk, how they learn that there are things in the world besides themselves. That was, for me, the transformational moment of the first year of motherhood. And what I did was I realized, that moment when my daughter began to understand language, that was the beginning of the end of her, that was the end of her babyhood and the beginning of the rest of my life as a mother. And one of the things I write about is that the Latin root of the word infant is enfance, and it means incapable of speech. And so there really is, even historically and linguistically in etymology, a distinction between a baby or an infant who doesn't know any language and a younger child who does have a sense of being in the world in terms of consciousness and language. And so that was absolutely been the high point. The low point occurred probably when my daughter was about 9 months old, and I was completely exhausted. I realized she was never going to go away. My life was never going to be returned to me in the same way it had been before, that the daily chores of being a mother were never going to go away, and that I was doing it all in relative isolation. I was completely exhausted, and I was completely exhausted by the culture of mothering, which I felt to be extremely isolated and extremely difficult, because nobody seemed to value motherhood except for other mothers. And I felt like I had lived this, really interesting life, and I had this great career, and I was a professor in this terrific program at University of San Francisco. But my motherhood and my maternity just really seemed to separate me from the rest of the world entirely. And I write about this in a chapter called "The American Woman's Home," and what I talk about in the book, and what I continue to think to this day, is that while the second wave feminism gave me my right to my education, it gave my mother her education, it got me into the working world and afforded me opportunities that women had never had before, my generation, it also really devalued the home and devalued child rearing. And I came to love my home, and I came to love the domestic life, and I came to believe that raising my daughter and educating my daughter and the discipline of teaching her was one of the most important things that I had done. And so I had to really not learn to balance work life and home life, but had to learn how to change my point of view and understand that my private life was in every way the equivalent of my working life. And so I came to believe, in the way that many 19th century women came to believe and argued in these really interesting handbooks that I write about in my book, that the life of the home isn't marginal, the life of the home isn't separate, the life of the home isn't secondary to the life of the commercial world and commerce and, consuming. But the life of the home is actually equivalent. It's the kind of the center of life, in the same way that the marketplace can be the center of life. And so I still, to this day, I have to remind myself the work of the home is as important as my writing life. And if I don't tell myself that every single day, then I lose a little bit of myself. And I think that's one of the challenges that faces us as we talk about work-life balance. I don't think the real issue is how much a parent works in or out of the home. I think that there are women and men who work very, very long hours, but for whom the home is still absolutely central and primary. And I think that we need to think about changing our point of view as much as we need to think about balancing the hours that we spend in different parts of our lives. Here's another tough question. What's the most difficult challenge or health issue that you and or your children have faced? My kids have been really healthy. I've been lucky. But one of the things that happened after I had my son was that I really, I took on too much. I was trying to accomplish everything, and I got really, really sick with migraines. And it took a year of medication and, constant supervision by a doctor and CAT scans and lots of drugs before I really got them under control. And this is just to say that the balance can be really difficult, and you have to pay attention first to yourself. it was a tough year. And, you know, I think that when some people read my book, they can have the mistaken impression that everything was great and wonderful, even though it wasn't. I write about the difficult times in the book as well. But, you know, everyone who has a child in their life, everyone who becomes a parent faces real challenges. And for me, some of those challenges came after I had my second child. I always like to say that having one child really made everything in my life better. Having two made everything worse for about 2 years. And now I'm kind of on the other side of that and beginning to, you know, readjust. And that's the other message of the book that I think is paramount and crucial. And that is that the only thing you can expect in motherhood is change. And the only thing that is certain is change. That's the bedrock of motherhood. And every single chapter in the book examines a different kind of change and what that means for your, you know, physical being, your psychological being, your emotional being, your spiritual being. A reader wants to know, a lot of you wanted to know what's the biggest surprise about motherhood that I hadn't expected. And the answer to that is very simple. I had not expected it to be interesting. No one had told me that it was interesting. And that really, again, is the reason that I wrote the book, is to try to communicate a little bit more about why it is interesting. What's the single most important lesson a woman who's about to have her first baby must know? I would say the single most important thing you can do is to educate yourself. Read as much as you can. Get as many factual books as you can. Ask your doctor as many questions as you can. But the most important thing that you have to come to grips with, I think, is not to expect anything. You can know everything in the world, and then your plan will go, everything will go completely different than you planned. Your birth will be different, your pregnancy will be different, your child will be different, and every pregnancy has its own story, and every child has their own story. And if you don't expect anything, then you can learn to pay attention to your own story in the most productive way, I think. So here are three tough questions that were asked on the Reddit thread. One was a question about the placenta. And I can't really answer the specific question that was on the Reddit thread about the placenta, which was about eating the placenta, and I don't really know anything about that. But what I do know, and what I do write about in my book, is that the placenta is the most complicated organ in the body aside from the brain. It controls everything about the pregnancy. It controls all the hormones. It probably controls labor and delivery. It is an absolutely miraculous and endlessly complicated and kind of mystifying structure. And again, it's one of the things that nobody really tells you about before you become pregnant. So if you can read about the placenta or learn about the placenta and understand just how powerful it is, you know, you begin to get a sense of just how transformative and kind of otherworldly becoming a mother can be. Another reader wanted to know about maternal violence against kids, and I don't have an answer to this specific question, but what I will say is that we all have days when our children are difficult, are challenging. You know, we all get angry, you know, at different times for different reasons. But I wanted to address the question because I think that one of the things that I didn't expect about being a mother, and one of the things we don't talk about nearly enough about being a mother and really being a parent in general, is that becoming a mother involves tremendous emotional resources, and that those are probably the most important things that you can cultivate as you get ready for becoming a mother and as you are raising your children. Is you have to have this really profound sense of emotional security, and you have to be emotionally resilient, because that's really the only way that you can cope with the stress and the challenge of being a mother, the stress and the challenge of the fatigue, and also the stress and the challenges that your kids throw at you. And that bit of being a mother gets much harder. So I think that that's the single most important thing about becoming a mother is cultivating those emotional resources to deal with your children every single day. And the last one was, what feeling does a mother truly feel when this life she's been growing and nurturing gets to a point where it doesn't need mother anymore? I haven't gotten to that point yet with my kids, and I'm not even at that point yet with my own mother. I still feel like I need her. But, you know, I have a very dear friend in the novelist Louis Busby, whose daughter is older than my daughter. And he's been an amazing mentor in terms of my writing, but also an amazing mentor in terms of my parenting. And he says, That's their job. The kid's job is to grow up. The kid's job is to separate from you. The kid's job is to become independent. And so I keep telling myself every time they show, a desire to move away from me, a desire to be independent, a desire to, rush off to school, a desire to play with their friends instead of me, I say that's what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to challenge you. They're supposed to grow up. So I temper my, some of the loss that happens every single day with a sense of what the kids are gaining. And again, that's another thing that I write about in the book, is that motherhood puts you in touch with the productive tensions of life. You have to be really grounded in the moment, but you have to look toward the long term. Motherhood is also really very, very interesting in that way. I have a couple other questions that are just from the Reddit thread. They're also about the writing of the book and just being a writer, generally speaking. Was there anything else that you wanted to become besides an author? And the answer to that is very simple, and it's no, I didn't. I always wanted to write. I was that kid on the playground, with a book, writing stories. There was no other way for me. Here's a question from a reader about who should read the book. Who's my audience? And this is, again, another question that I've gotten a lot this spring as I've been, touring and answering questions about the book. And the question is about men. What would you suggest that men, perhaps potential fathers, should read this, especially prior to becoming a father? And the answer to that is yes. That's one of the reasons that I wrote the book. And in fact, I've gotten some really great feedback, some of my favorite feedback from fathers who said, I wish I had this book before my wife got pregnant. This is the book that helps explain to me why my wife is acting the way she is, what's different about her now, what I can expect from her, what the first year might be like. I really, really wanted to write the book that would translate the very ordinary experience for people who were never going to have that experience. There are lots of books out there that are just for women, educating them and telling a personal story that they can relate to or recoil from. But my book really is about why and how things change. And I do hope that fathers read it. I know that fathers are reading it, and I hope that more read it. That question is also related to the last question on the Reddit thread that I have an answer for, and that is, what's the most amazing fan response you've gotten to A Double Life so far? The book had a really interesting journey to publication, and part of that is because it's not a how-to, and it's not a straightforward personal narrative, but it blends medical fact and scientific research with my personal story. So agents and early editors at publishing houses really didn't know where they were going to put it. They said, oh, is this going to sit on the how-to shelf? Is this going to sit on the memoir shelf? Does it belong in the parenting section or the nonfiction section? And my answer was, well, it can go anywhere you want it to go. But because it didn't fit an easy niche, it had a long road to publication. But one of the most gratifying responses I've gotten is that readers get it. I knew that if I could find a publisher, which I did with, University of Nebraska has been wonderful to me, that readers would understand it. And in fact, they do. They come to me and they've said, this was the book I've been looking for. This book explains exactly how I was feeling. This book has helped my husband to understand me better. This book has helped me to understand what the big deal is. But probably the most interesting response I got was at the very first reading I did at a really amazing bookstore in the Bay Area, and the young man who introduced me, was in his 20s. He was this terrific bookseller. He wasn't married. He didn't have kids. He wasn't even thinking about having kids. And he said in his introduction what a lot of people warned me about. And he said, oh, when I picked up this book, I thought, oh, gee, here's another book about motherhood. This really isn't a book for me. But then I started reading it, and I realized this was a book I could give my mother. This was a book that would help me understand my mother better. And this was a book that I could show to my mother and say, now I understand what you went through. And honestly, that's the reason that I wrote the book. The question is, how did I come up with the title for my book? And that's a great question. The title, A Double Life Discovering Motherhood, really comes from the fact that when I got pregnant, when I became a mother, I felt like my life had been doubled. My life had been split into a before and an after. Before the pregnancy and after the pregnancy. But there was another aspect to it. There was also the doubling that occurred because I felt like I was myself, but I also had this other person growing inside of me. So I was never really alone, and I was never really singular in the same way that I had been before. And then, there's the third sense that all women feel when after they become mothers is you have a double life, because you have your life as a mother and you also have your life as an individual, and those two things don't always coincide. There's a sense of being, in the home and out of the home, in your domestic life and in your public life. So I think that there are very many ways that women are doubled or experience a kind of double life after they become pregnant. And the discovering motherhood part is really because that's what the book is about. It is absolutely an investigation into the journey toward motherhood, the process of motherhood, the active experience and uncovering of what it really means to become a mother. What advice do I have for expectant mothers who are also writers? The most important thing I can tell you is to get enough sleep. Sleep when your baby sleeps. Take at least one of those naps during the day to make sure that you're rested. Because if you're not rested yourself, you can't think well. At least I couldn't think well enough to pursue my writing. And the second most important thing I can tell you is that you have to show up every single day, or 3 times a week, whatever your routine is. Show up at your desk and write and get down on paper all of those things that you are thinking and feeling and scratching on the backs of napkins and notebooks while your baby is awake. But use every second of that sleep time to get your own writing done. And the third thing is something that I learned from the writing of Grace Paley, and it's something that I've struggled with mightily over the last 9 years as I've been raising my children and writing my books and getting my career off the ground. And that is, if you're going to be home with your children, and if you're going to be spending a lot of time doing the primary caregiving, I had to resign myself to writing what Grace Paley calls writing at different paces, which meant I might not get my book out in 3 years. It might take 5 or 10 years to get my book out. I might not finish my work in the same way that I was finishing my work before I had children, but that was okay. That I would have more time when my children were in school full time, and I needed to understand that being a mother was important, and my career might proceed more slowly, and that was okay, and that it would change over the course of my kids' lives and my writing career. The question is, have I faced any challenges in my writing? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. The first challenge I face being a writer and a parent is finding the time to get the writing done. And I address that most of the time by being really disciplined about writing when my kids are either in school or asleep, during their naps during the day. And the second way I've addressed that challenge is by resigning myself to writing at different paces, understanding that there will be months and sometimes years where I won't get as much work done as I like. But that absolutely changes as your kids get older and as they enter school, and I have more time returned to me. And I've actually written a lot about this in essays and periodicals and things. The second biggest challenge I faced is just editors and readers and reviewers not understanding or believing or wanting to acknowledge that a book about motherhood can also be a literary book. I think a lot of times people assume that books about motherhood, writing about motherhood, stories about motherhood, essays about motherhood are really only for other mothers. And I think that is, I think that's wrongheaded. I think that writing about motherhood, our stories, our essays, our discussions really address a whole range of human experiences. And I think that when we put them in a niche or put them all in one category or put them all on, a single website, and readers who are interested in literary writing more generally ignore them, I think we do, a great disservice to, a tremendous body of literature. This is a great range of writing about women, by women, about maternity and motherhood and children that is, fantastically, rich and rewarding. And that's the conversation that I want to be part of. The question is, what was the process of getting published like? I had a very long road to publication with this book. I had a difficult time finding an agent and a difficult time finding an editor because they didn't know what to do with my book. They didn't know if it was, a how-to book. They didn't know if it was a personal narrative book. And they said, we love that, almost every agent and editor who saw the draft of the manuscript said, oh, we love your writing. Can you write us something else? Or we love your writing. Can you write us a novel? We love your writing, but I don't know what to do with this book. I don't know how to sell it, or I don't know where to shelve it. So my agent and I pulled the book, and we said, okay, I'm just going to publish another book first, and we'll wait for this one. And in the meantime, I submitted it to a contest with the journal River Teeth, which is a really excellent nonfiction literary journal out of the University of Ashland in Oregon, and they have an annual prize looking for the best nonfiction manuscript. And I sent it off, and I forgot about it. And about 2 months later, I got a phone call that I had won the prize, and I was completely surprised and astonished. It was unexpected, and it was thrilling. And part of the prize was a deal with University of Nebraska Press, who brought the book out. They did a terrific job editing it. They did a terrific job designing it. I love the cover. And after that, took about a year from the prize to publication, and the publication experience has been terrific. Done lots of really fun radio interviews, lots of fun op-eds, lots of great new writing experiences, and the experience of publication has been especially gratifying because it's connected me with readers, and it's allowed me to talk about motherhood in ways that I had always really wanted to talk about motherhood. I wanted to really move the conversation away from the sensational, away from the specifically personal, and toward the issues of motherhood that are more universal. Why do our spiritual lives change? How do our political lives change? How do our emotional lives change? How do our marriages change? The kinds of transformations that really ground any woman's journey to becoming a mother. The question is, what advice would I give to a young writer trying to get exposure? I teach in an MFA program at the University of San Francisco, so I deal every day with not just young writers, but emerging writers, people who are just beginning to make their career as writers. The most important piece of advice is to get the writing done. The most important piece of advice is to figure out what your voice is and who you are as a writer and how you want to enter the conversation. There is absolutely no substitute for perfecting your craft and making sure that you are writing the very best fiction or nonfiction that you can write. That's your first job, is showing up at your desk every single day and getting the job done. That is much more important than having a Facebook page or an author page or having a blog, is really sinking into your craft. Beyond that, I would say the next step is to look out into the world of publishing, and I would say look in all venues. Look online, look in niche markets. If there's something you know a lot about that other people don't know a lot about, look to those specific magazines and journals. Are you writing about yoga? Are you writing about food? Are you writing about mountaineering? Are you writing about, children? Find your niche market, whether it's online, whether it's in print, whether it's a local newspaper, whether it's a literary journal, and figure out how you want to enter the conversation. What do you have new to say, and who do you want to say it to? Because the hardest part of writing and trying to publish is finding the right editor at the right time in the right place. And all those three things have to align in order for you to get a yes to publication. And editor's job is to say no. There are so many people out there trying to get published that they're going to say no, and they're going to say no until the day that they say yes. So it's your job as a young or emerging writer to figure out what you have to say and who you have to say it to, and then just to keep persevering and keep accepting no and not taking it personally and moving on and perfecting your craft. And a lot of the game is perseverance and staying with it. And that's what I tell my students every day, and it's what I tell myself every day, because I still have editors saying no to me as well. I am working on new writing projects. I actually have co-edited a book with Caroline Grant, who is the senior editor of Literary Mama and a really good friend of mine. And we've co-edited a book of original essays about food. And it's called The Dish, Making the Food That Makes Your Family. And it will be published by Shambhala Press in fall of 2012. So that is a big new project that we're working on. We're really excited about it. We've got a great lineup of writers, food writers and parent writers and literary writers, all writing about why food matters and how, and the culture of food in a family, and why it's why it's an important part of human life. So I'm working on that.